the castle of Dürnstein, which overlooked this scene and which recalls the memory of the captivity of Richard Coeur de Lion, added to the moral effect produced by the combat which had just ended in so happy a way. The sight of these old towers inspired Napoleon with reflections which are thus reported by General Pillet in his histories of the campaign of 1809. The emperor was riding between Berthier and Laon when a guide pointed out to him between Moulques and St. Polten the towers of the castle of Dürnstein, which could be seen far off. The emperor halted and spent some time in looking at these ruins. Continuing his ride, he said to Berthier and Laon, he also had been to fight in Palestine. He had been more fortunate than we were at Acre, but not braver than you, my good Laon. He had defeated the great Saladin, and in spite of that, hardly had he returned to the shores of Europe than he fell into the hands of people who were certainly not his equals. He was sold by an Austrian duke to an emperor of Germany who shut him up and who is only remembered by this act of felony. The last of all his court, Blondel alone remained faithful to him, but his people made great sacrifices for his deliverance. Napoleon seemed unable to turn his eyes away from these towers. He added, such indeed were those barbaric times which people are foolish enough to depict as so grand, when the father sacrificed his children, the wife her husband, the subject his sovereign, the soldier his general, when everything was done without shame and even without disguise, for the lust of gold or power. How times are changed since then! What progress our civilization has made. You have seen emperors and kings in my power, besides their capitals and their states, and I have exacted from them neither ransom nor any sacrifice of honor. And this successor of Leopold and of Henry, who is already more than half in our power, no more harm will be done to him than last time, in spite of his somewhat treacherous attack. Abandoning himself gradually to profound reflections, the emperor fell into a sad melancholy, to which we all remain foreign. For who could follow the master of Europe, the giver of crowns, in his mighty thoughts? What things must have risen before his eyes? He alone knew the fury of his enemies and all that they would dare, if ever they had the power over him, which he so often might have used against them. Who could foresee that at that time, that this new Coeur de Lion would have to envy the fate of him of the 11th century? Whilst the emperor was at St. Polten, he received a second visit from General Giulet, coming on behalf of the Emperor of Austria to renew his proposals of an armistice. This application was as unsuccessful as the first. Its result was rather to accelerate than to retard the onward march of the French army. The Grand Army entered Vienna the next day, the Austrians having decided not to defend their capital. They had thought of disputing the crossing of the Danube, in spite of the fact that the bridges had not been broken down and inflammable material had been prepared to blow them up on the approach of the French. The taking of these bridges and of the Big Tabor Bridge by surprise, carried out by an audacious ruse by Marshals Ney and Murat, rendered the French masters of these most valuable approaches. The emperor went and established himself in the castle of Schönbrunn, where he spent 2 days, using this short time to advantage in organizing the Vienna police. Napoleon appointed General Clark governor of the city and ordered him to maintain the most rigid discipline and to protect the citizens. At the same time, he prescribed military arrangements for protecting his rear. He thereupon left Schönbrunn to pursue the Russian army, which, after having joined in with the remnants of the Austrian army, was retreating upon Moravia. Before leaving Schönbrunn, the emperor received the news of the submission of the Tyrol, which Marshal Ney had been ordered to occupy. A touching scene took place at Innsbruck after the marshal's entry into this town. An officer of the 76th Infantry Regiment, discovered in the arsenal 2 flags which had fallen into the hands of the enemy during the preceding war, and whose loss had been deplored by the whole regiment. The sight of these glorious insignia, riddled with bullets and so gloriously recovered, brought tears to the eyes of the old soldiers. It was a real family feast when Marshal Ney handed these flags back to the regiment. The emperor ordered the memory of this scene to be perpetuated by a picture and a medal. Crossing through Vienna only, the French army accordingly continued its march in pursuit of the Russian army. The rear guard of the army was caught up at Hollabrunn, a village situated halfway between Vienna and Brunn. The meeting gave rise to a sanguinary battle, from which the baggage corps was only able to make good its escape through the darkness of the night, leaving behind them a goodly number of prisoners in our hands and a battlefield covered with their dead. The Russians set fire to all that they passed and destroyed the most beautiful villages in Moravia. The emperor, on his way to Hollabrunn, was delayed on his journey by the burning of one of these villages. He spent more than an hour in the midst of the frantic inhabitants, using his escort to help them save their house and to arrest the progress of the flames. The French army was so fatigued that in spite of Napoleon's wish not to grant the Russian army a moment's respite, he thought it necessary to give his soldiers a day's rest. His first columns entered into Brunn the next day, where they found abundant provisions of all kinds. During Napoleon's stay at Brunn, before the Battle of Austerlitz, he had received Monsieur Auwitz, the Prussian envoy, who had come to his audience chamber by means of a secret staircase. The persons in attendance were sent out, and it was I who was charged to introduce him. This was on the eve of the emperor's departure, Napoleon wishing to make all speed to join his bivouac between Brunn and Austerlitz, where he spent the week which preceded the great battle. He refused to listen to any communication from the King of Prussia's envoy, postponing all explanations until after the battle which, according to appearances, was about to be fought. When he returned victorious to Vienna, he gave audience to Monsieur Daugwitz. On the very evening of his arrival in Schönbrunn, the minister took care not to show the Potsdam Treaty, which he had brought with him. He complimented the emperor on his victory, and Napoleon replied, "That is a compliment whose destination has been changed by fortune." Indeed, the past 10 days had totally changed the situation for everybody, and the Prussian envoy was inspired with very different sentiments from those with which he had come. He decided, and rightly so, that the time for threats had passed by, that he had to get himself out of a scrape, and thought of nothing but how to get Napoleon to forget the hostile attitude which the government of his king had taken up. The emperor received Monsieur Daugwitz with kindness. The envoy's attitude had not been hostile to France, but he was not chary in blaming the Prussian cabinet for the perfidy of its conduct. He dictated the terms of a treaty to Monsieur Daugwitz, which the latter accepted, and by which Napoleon offered Prussia in the form of an alliance, which it was his desire to make lasting, a chance of safety of which Prussia was foolish enough not to take advantage. The Austrian general, Jules, presented himself for the third time to the emperor at Brunn, accompanied by Monsieur de Stadion. These two envoys came to renew the offer which the first of them had already made twice at Linz and at St. Poland, to come to an understanding as to the conditions of peace. Napoleon consented to treat then and there and to decide upon the preliminaries of peace, but he could not commit the mistake of accepting a simple armistice without taking advantage of his position. The Austrian envoys did not think fit to accept the conditions which he imposed. The Russians, before the Battle of Austerlitz, had asked for nothing less than the return of the French army to the Rhine, and had proposed several other unacceptable conditions which were in harmony with those which later on they tried to impose at the emperor at Prague. The emperor had sent General Savary from his bivouac to present his compliments to the Emperor Alexander, and at the same time to take notice of what was going on around him. Savary brought back with him Prince Dolgoruki, one of the most influential of the emperor's young counselors. This officer considered the French army in jeopardy and did not doubt that Napoleon would be glad to escape an imminent disaster. The retreat, which the emperor had ordered for the purpose of choosing his battlefield, and the position of his camp had confirmed Prince Dolgoruki in this opinion. He addressed the emperor with assurance and argued on political questions with a presumption which revealed his inexperience in these matters. He undertook to demonstrate to his master's redoubtable adversary the necessity of abandoning his conquests and of giving up possession of Italy and even of Belgium in the interest of a durable peace. Napoleon listened to this strange talk and these unseasonable insinuations, which were simple braggadocio, with great patience and coolness. The only answer he gave was by making his final arrangements for the battles which he was going to fight. In the night which preceded this memorable day, the emperor visited the bivouacs of his troops on foot. He was soon recognized, in spite of his incognito, and was received with an enthusiasm difficult to describe. By a concerted movement, the camp was suddenly illuminated by thousands of straw torches, which each bivouac raised aloft to salute the emperor and to celebrate the anniversary of his coronation. Napoleon, deeply touched by this improvised act of homage, expressed his regret on returning to his bivouac and having on the morrow to fight a battle which would rob him of a large number of these good fellows, and added that he considered this the best evening of his life. The sun shone the next morning on the battle of Austerlitz. The emperor on horseback, from the break of day, surrounded by his marshals, kept them by his side until the mist, which in that season betokens a fine morning, and had been entirely dispelled. Then, on the signal which he gave, each galloped off to his corps. I saw General Junot, who was rather late, rush up and throw himself into the saddle with an air of resolution, which showed that he had no intention of sparing himself. It was not long before the sound of the cannon was heard. The emperors of Austria and Russia witnessed from the heights on which they were placed the complete routing of their armies. This battle, which was one of the greatest which Napoleon ever won, and the issue of which, thanks to his skillful tactics and the madness of his adversaries, was never in doubt for an instant, ended this campaign, which had lasted 2 months. Prince John of Liechtenstein presented himself in the morning of the next day at our outposts. He came to ask the Emperor Napoleon to grant an interview to the Emperor of Austria. Napoleon consented after some hesitation and could not help saying, after he had taken leave of the prince, "This man makes me commit a great mistake. It is not after battles that conferences can be held. I ought today to be nothing but a soldier. As such, I ought to follow up my victory and not listen to words of peace." The interview was fixed for the morrow at a bivouac near the Saar-Ullschitz mill, about 3 leagues from Austerlitz. On December 4th, the Emperor Napoleon set out on horseback at 9 o'clock in the morning, accompanied by Marshal Berthier, the chief officers of his military household, and a part of his guard for the meeting which had been agreed upon. He arrived there before the Emperor of Austria, who drove up shortly after his arrival in an open carriage, accompanied by Prince John of Liechtenstein, several field marshals and generals of his army, and escorted by a squadron of Hungarian cavalry. The emperor went up to meet the Emperor of Austria and embraced him. They drew up to the fire, whilst their suites withdrew to fires which had been lighted within view, but sufficiently far off to prevent that the two sovereigns were saying would be heard. The conference lasted about 2 hours, and the two monarchs agreed upon an armistice and the principal conditions of peace. The Emperor Francis asked that a truce might be granted to the Russian army. Napoleon consented on condition that the Russians should evacuate Germany and Prussian and Austrian Poland and return to Russia. In the movement caused by the separation of the two emperors, their officers approached them and overheard the Austrian monarch saying to Napoleon, apparently in answer to some remark of his, "I promise not to fight you anymore." The Russian army was surrounded on all sides and had no chance of escape. The Russian troops were fleeing in such disorder that the Emperor Alexander, separated from his followers, was in danger of falling into the enemy's hands. He sent flag of truce after flag of truce to Marshal Davout to obtain a suspension of arms, but the marshal pursued his onward march. General Meerfeld, whose vanguard had been routed by Marshal Davout's soldiers, sent the marshal the following note written in pencil. Colonel Count Valmodin will go with a bugler to the French general in command of the 3rd Division of the Corps d'Armée, and will inform him that there is an armistice lasting from 6 o'clock this morning till 6 o'clock tomorrow morning. H.M., the Emperor of Germany, being in conference with the Emperor of the French at Auschwitz, by order of His Majesty the Emperor of Russia, signed Meerfeld, Lieutenant General. Marshal Davout, having answered M. de Meerfeld that his note did not seem to him a sufficient guarantee, he having very naturally to be on his guard against these little ruses, and quoting to him amongst examples that of Steyr, declared that he required a written assurance from the Emperor Alexander. M. de Meerfeld assured the marshal that he should shortly receive satisfaction in this respect, and that all his doubts would be dispelled. Colonel Valmodin immediately set out to search for the Emperor of Russia, but did not know, in the extreme confusion which reigned in the Russian army, where to look for him. At last, after numerous comings and goings, he saw afar off some mounted guards, whom he recognized by the height and the shape of their helmets. He rode in this direction and found the Emperor Alexander with Prince Chertovsky, his Minister of Foreign Affairs. The Russian sovereign, on hearing that was demanded of him by Marshal Davout, declared that he could not write this note and ordered Prince Chertovsky to write it in his name. Colonel Valmodin, having pointed out to him that Marshal Davout would not stop his movement unless an assurance was given in the Emperor's own writing, Alexander, in order to avoid being taken prisoner by the French troops who were approaching, consented to write the letter. It was written in the following words and in pencil, pen and ink not being procurable. General Meerfeld is authorized to tell Marshal Davout from me that a truce of 24 hours has been agreed upon for the interview which the 2 supreme chiefs of their nations will hold together today at Auschwitz. Signed, Alexander. One of the Russian emperor's aides-de-camp, accompanying Colonel Valmodin, carried this note to Marshal Davout. The marshal was forced to believe this formal assurance of the suspension of hostilities and the meeting of the 2 emperors. He accordingly halted and took up his position at Josefsdorf, where he happened to be sending word to the Russian commander-in-chief Kutuzov, who had also written to him that hostilities would be suspended until 6 o'clock on the following morning, and that in order to avoid all error or surprise, notice of the end of the truce would be given 1 hour previously. The Emperor Alexander, delivered from the extreme perplexity and the great anxieties which had beset him, took refuge at Holich, on the left bank of the march. The confusion of the various scattered corps of the Russian army was so complete that the Emperor Alexander remained separated from his servants for nearly a week, and that Prince Chertovsky, his minister, had, so to speak, to act as his valet. It should be added, in the interest of truth, that the assurances given by the Russian monarch to Marshal Davout were not strictly true. An armistice between the Austrian and French armies had certainly been agreed upon by the Emperor Napoleon and the Emperor of Austria, but the truce, as far as the Russian army was concerned, though consented to in principle, had not yet been notified. Another hour's march, and Davout would have made the Tsar his prisoner. The marshal, to clear himself, sent the note on to the Emperor, who ordered me to preserve it in his portfolio as one of the most important documents of the history of this war.